Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Family Tree, A Lynching in Georgia, A Legacy of Secrets and My Search for the Truth, by Karen Branan, narrated by Pam Ward. O man God, I beg that this that I ask for my enemies shall come to pass, that the south wind shall scorch their bodies and make them wither, and shall not be tempered to them, that the north wind shall freeze their blood and numb their muscles, and that it shall not be tempered to them, that the west wind shall blow away their life's breath, and will not leave their hair to grow, and that their fingernails shall fall off, and their bones shall crumble, that the east wind shall make their minds grow dark, their sight shall fail, and their seed dry up, so that they shall not multiply. An ancient Negro folk curse recorded by Zora Neale Hurston. Prologue. In 1984, Gemama was 90, and I was a middle-aged journalist sitting on the edge of her magnificent antique sleigh bed, atop her hand-crocheted ecru coverlet littered with orange peels, gazing at those perfectly manicured, fire-engine red nails I'd known since childhood. We were in her house in Hamilton, Georgia, the house I had known since childhood. The ever-present Salem cigarette teetered precariously between her long white fingers. She'd smoked 3 packs a day for as long as I could remember. Now she was little more than bones and wrinkles and a cloud-wisp of hair. But the life force was as fierce as ever. I had come to hear her stories and preserve them for my children and future generations. Placing my tape recorder gently beside her, I, someone who had unflinchingly interviewed murderers, corrupt officials, and gang leaders, eased timidly into an oral history with this frail woman. Any fears of intimidating her with equipment and interrogations vanished as she slipped into Tallulah Bankhead mode, spinning stories of girlhood crushes on male school teachers, her love of handwork, her pride in her antiques, and other pretty things. There were few needlecrafts she had not mastered. Above the mantelpiece next to her bed hung a large tinted photograph, Miss Berta as a young belle, brown eyes flirtatious beneath an elegant straw bonnet, proudly perched atop careful curls. The hat was a gift from Mr. Bob, her father. She was his only child, an adored, spoiled, quick-tempered, high-strung girl. Gemama had clearly relished our conversation, but I could see that both she and the tape were running out, so I decided to end with a simple question. "And what is your most unforgettable memory?" I asked. "The hanging," she replied without pause, a faint, nervous smile playing at her thin lips. "They hanged a woman and some men right downtown in Hamilton when I was young. I was told to stay home, but everyone else was going, so I sneaked out." As I look back on that moment, in which I was exposed to the first whiff of knowledge about a huge and terrible event, I realized that a combination of ignorance, inexperience, a lack of readiness, and a certain training in Southern behavior made me hold my tongue. In the adjoining parlor, my mother eavesdropped. "You can't believe some things she says," she warned me as I left. "She embroiders, you know." I could not know then that 11 years later I'd embark on a full-scale excavation of this piece of family history, and that my mother, who learned early to revere her share of patriarchs, would continue the embroidery of memory. My experience with memory embroidery began early, though I would not see it that way until I began my research for this book. When I was 11 and my sister 10, we learned that my father was keeping a huge secret from us. Although he was still a well-loved and successful physician at the time, he was drunk, as he often was back then when he told us this story. As usual, we'd been begging him to stop drinking, and so he told us this story as a way of explaining why he drank and could not stop. When he was a very young man living in Hamilton, he had accidentally killed a young black woman. She sassed him, he explained. She had refused to step aside to let him pass. "I backhanded her, and her head hit one of those iron poles outside Cook's store," I didn't mean to kill her." His patent leather hair glistened in the late afternoon gloom of our living room. I thought he looked like Clark Gable. "Nothing was ever done," he continued in a voice softened by alcohol. "They just took her home, told some lie, and nothing was ever said about it again." Then he added, "If you ever want to punish someone for a crime, do nothing. They'll do a much better job on themselves than you could ever do." I took that knowledge, made more potent by the warm bourbon of his breath, and tucked it away on a shelf reserved for things that scared me. In that way I never really forgot them. I simply deflated their power, turned them into stories. In 1993, on a rainy night in April, that story your mama told came looking for me in another bedroom, my own on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Outside, a gentle April rain fell. My husband was away in South Africa filming a documentary. This time the story came in the form of a hypnagogic vision, a scene appearing in the mind's eye at the threshold of sleep. I saw a large, dead black woman laid out at the end of my bed, a burn across one of her temples. She spoke without words, but the message was clear. Go home. Find out what happened. I had always sensed that a day would come when my career as a reporter and my complicated family history would collide in some crucial way, and I was certain that this was that long-expected assignment. I accepted it without question. I was not alone in my new preoccupation. The nation, indeed, the world, was being drawn to acknowledge past wrongs. While racial violence flared with the ruthless beating of Rodney King by Los Angeles police, followed by race riots and the burning of African-American churches throughout the South by white skinheads, old racial crimes were being revived, and some actually prosecuted. At the time that I experienced this vision at my home on Capitol Hill, I'd been thinking and writing about the young woman whom my father, now dead, told me long ago he'd accidentally killed. I'd been doing so as a way to ease her into my consciousness. I thought that she might be the one I saw in my vision, and thus went home to learn more about what happened between this nameless young black woman and the surly teenager who would become my father. I returned to Hamilton, a small town no longer peopled with my grandparents, aunts, and uncles, but still home to cousins and elderly men and women, black and white, with strong memories and ties to my kinfolk. It was no longer a thriving village of cotton gins and overflowing mercantiles, a train depot, large, ambitious white families, and long-time black servants. Now it was a town of antique shops and thrift stores, a tanning parlor, a drugstore, and several low-end restaurants. Still standing were the Confederate statue and the antebellum houses of Mobleys, Williamses, Hudsons, and Bells, one inhabited by little sister Hudson Garrett, the last descendant of one of the ruling families and still living on the square. "Your father never killed that woman," my Aunt Evelyn told me. She would know. Only 12 years old at the time, she was with him when whatever happened took place. Indeed, he'd told me it was Evelyn whose honor he was defending by smacking a black girl who refused to step off their path. He backhanded her, sure, that sassy little Pearlie Lee, but she didn't even fall down, much less die. Where'd he get that crazy idea? Why, Pearlie Lee died just recently. I checked. She was right. Others, black and white, men and women, confirmed her version. "Ben Williams never killed a soul," they'd say, shaking their heads in wonder that he could hold such a misconception for so long, could drink on it, drug on it, die, and carry it to his grave, never realizing it wasn't true. Nevertheless, as I asked my questions, other stories of violence, racial and otherwise, emerged. "Surely you know about Tip Top?" someone would ask. Then proceed to tell me about my great-uncle, Doc Williams, A rough-and-tumble, red-faced old son of a gun who murdered and was murdered atop Pine Mountain in 1920. And about Louis Sugar Bear Murray, a black man who was hanged in the jailhouse for the crimes of the rich men's sons who were really responsible. In addition to the Tip-Top murders, I was treated to more tales of white-on-white murders. The Mobley brothers who killed the Truett man who killed the Robinson man, and on it went. In the courthouse I found a parties unknown box of coroner's reports detailing more grisly murders, bodies of black men and women dumped in the river, weighted with rocks. On that one visit, I heard so many violent tales that as I drove home, I envisioned the waters of the serpentine Mulberry Creek and the once magnificent Chattahoochee River, red with blood, not clay, their beds pebbled with teeth and bones. Back in Evelyn's tiny dining room, I asked her about the hanging of Gimama's memory. "Oh, that," she half scoffed. "That was a bunch of men fighting over some colored woman." She took a drag off her cigarette, curled her lip, and added, rolling her eyes, "They did that back then, you know." The next day, at my sister's house in Atlanta, I picked up a book she'd just received for her birthday. There, in a sentence, I found all I needed. 3 men and a woman were lynched in Hamilton, Georgia, on January 22nd, 1912. Back home on Capitol Hill, adrenaline rushing, I sprinted the 7 blocks from home to the periodical reading room at the Library of Congress. At best, I'd thought I'd find a paragraph or two buried deeply within a newspaper. Wrongly, I'd assumed Southern newspaper editors were not proud of mob justice and often let such events escape notice. I had not expected bold headlines, a major front-page story in the Atlanta Constitution, 4 Negroes lynched by Hamilton Avengers, woman one of victims. Avengers? My brain tabulated. Avenging what? And then I saw it coming like headlights gleaming out of the fog. The 3rd bold-faced headline. Negroes were accused of murdering Hadley. Hadley? My mother's maiden name. Which Hadley? Murdered? This I'd never heard. The next headline and some further probing provided the answer. Hadley, who was a well-to-do planter, was shot Sunday afternoon while sitting in his home. Negroes held on suspicion. About 100 men in mob. By now I had stopped breathing, but not reading. Suddenly the microfilm machine lost focus, and while I fiddled frantically, an intercom announced that the library was closing, and lights began to blink. I would have to wait until tomorrow. I turned the machine off, and for a moment sat drawn into myself, barely breathing, eyes closed, scalp drawing tight, the way it does just before a virus settles in. Well, here it was, the thing I sought. "Be careful when you go shaking those family trees," Evelyn had warned. "You never know what you'll find." She was sure as hell right about that. Norman Hadley, the murder victim, was my cousin. My great-grandfather, Marion Madison Hadley, the newly elected sheriff, was his uncle. A sickening shock coursed through me. A cousin I'd never heard of had been shot through the head and killed. It never occurred to me that a kinsman had ever been murdered. Both sides of my family, sheriffs, deputies, a judge, legislators, a senator, seemed so well defended, especially against black people. A woman and 3 men, one of them a preacher, 2 of them farmers, all of them black, had been hanged by a mob of men, many surely related to Norman Hadley. Beside the baptismal pool outside the Friendship Baptist Church, a short walk from where the sheriff lived. Hanged and shot more than 300 times on a wintry January night. And as I sat there growing numb, I intuitively knew that many more of my kinfolk had been caught up in that madness, on one side or the other. I desperately hoped the sheriff had tried to stop it. In that moment I experienced an odd sense that I had known all these people. The murderers, the silent ones, the murdered ones, the powerless ones. I felt myself there with each man, woman, and child snared in that net, and I hungered for every detail of their lives. Who were they? How did they live, think, vote, love, laugh, write, speak, work, live, raise children, treat their neighbors? What did they know of one another, the murderers and the murdered? What long road had they traveled together? I was not willing to accept that this was simply the way white Southerners dealt with racial matters. This was, to my knowledge, the only public lynching ever carried out in Harris County. There was something I, and perhaps others, could learn from this tragic affair. Perhaps we could understand what turns mild-mannered, church-going family men into cold-blooded killers. How something so shameful happens in the heart of a simple village and virtually disappears, and where, if anywhere, it goes, whether it ripples down through generations, finding new forms in the future, and where, indeed, I might find its residue in my own life. I determined to learn all I could. Chapter 1. My Sweet Village. When I was a child, the nation was freshly out of World War II and recovering from the Great Depression. Farm folks were scraping the manure off their shoes, getting educations, and entering professions, buying ranch houses in the city and not looking back. While my father's family, the Williamses, had more than most, they had still suffered during the Depression. My mother's people, Hadleys and Moores, never had much of anything. Mama remembered hunger and her excitement when any old piece of meat came their way. She talked about the women's, her grandmother's, her mother's, her own fears of having to go to work in the cotton mills. My father's mother scrimped and struggled in her chicken business to send her smartest son to medical school. Being a doctor spared my father from war, an escape he did not appreciate, but it provided him a job with the military as medical inspector for the brothels of Phoenix City, Alabama, across the Chattahoochee. My parents, a dazzling couple, dressed fashionably and belonged to the country club, while my father moved from one beautiful woman to the next, one glittering new automobile to another, over the course of my childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. For 5 short years, from 1941 to 1946, we lived more or less as a family in a brand-new white brick ranch house on a manicured half-acre lawn in a neighborhood inhabited by the families of doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. Our street, Clubview Drive, abutted the golf course of the Columbus Country Club, and in the white-fenced green pasture across from our house pranced American saddlebreds and other magnificent show horses. When I was 5 and my sister 4, our parents divorced, an almost unheard-of event in 1946, and my charmed world turned cloudy. We stayed on Clubview Drive, but my mother went to work selling notions at Curvin's, a department store owned by members of my father's family. She hired a black maid named Ednell Allen Armstead, whom we called Edna. Sometime after Edna became my daytime mother, I began to notice and chafe against my mother's racism. Once, in those early years, she spanked me at Curvin's for drinking from the Negro water fountain. The sign read colored, so I thought the water would be pink, perhaps blue. This is my first memory of my training in racial etiquette. From an early age it rankled me that Edna had to use the back door in the garage bathroom, that she had to sit in the back seat of the car even when no one else was in the passenger seat. It wasn't that I was entirely tolerant. I could use the word nigger as easily as any of my friends. In early adolescence, I went out with neighbor boys in the bed of a pickup and hurled eggs in the dark at hapless black people in their neighborhood, an action fraught with so much potential tragedy it haunts me yet. And in my adolescent eagerness to integrate Edna into my world, I would thoughtlessly order her to sit up front when I drove her home. Wisely, I now realize, she refused. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. On Sunday mornings, dressed in velvet and lace, the little white children of First Baptist sang, Jesus loves the little children. Of all the church songs, I loved this one most, and sang it non-stop and off-key in the back seat of my Aunt Nana's green DeSoto, annoying my mother, aunt, my sister Barbara, and my double first cousins, Bill and Steve, on the endless 24-mile after-church drive up Georgia Highway 29 to my Hadley grandparents in Hamilton. It was later that I began to detect the contradictions between the song and our lives. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, we made that drive, the four little cousins punching and poking one another as we drank in the sights from my aunt's crowded, wool-upholstered back seat. Acres of cotton fields plowed and planted in fiery heat by Negro men behind plodding mules. Chained black convicts, pickaxes pounding rock along the narrow highway, chanting their mournful dirge. Miles of clay-coated green kudzu dangling from power lines. A Visit the Everglades billboard with a picture of a glass-bottomed boat posted on land owned by Big Mama, my paternal grandmother. Mangled carcasses of roadkill all along the highway, possums, coons, dogs, and rattlesnakes grazed on by buzzards. Halfway to Hamilton, in the middle of nowhere, our tires rattled across the wooden bridge over Mulberry Creek, just past the big house, a large white two-story farmhouse with a deep wrap-around veranda where my father grew up. We'd turn left at Mamie's cabin, back in the woods on William's land. There she'd be waiting, my grandmother Williams's old cook, likely the granddaughter of a Williams slave, now skin and bones. With a wide, toothless grin, she'd reach out to touch us babies as she deposited her weekly, sweet-smelling bundle of fresh laundry, tied up in a white sheet, onto the floor of the back seat. Tucked into its center was a jug of muscadine wine, which, as we cousins grew older, we found courage to sip secretly. As Nana's pokey car finally nosed into town, having stopped at least once for someone, usually my cousin Steve, to get a roadside whipping, we'd first pass the massive Bell Williams Mobley house, handed down in my father's family since the 1830s, and still occupied by cousins. Then, to our left on the square, we'd see the once gleaming 21-foot marble Confederate soldier, now blackened by time and neglect, but still honored each Confederate Memorial Day, when lines of elders and schoolchildren laid wild wisteria at his feet. Fate denied them victory, but crowned them with glorious immortality, read the words inscribed on its base. Downtown Hamilton consisted of little more than 4 square blocks around Monument Square. 3 elegant houses anchored and decorated 3 of its compass points, all of them large, boxy antebellums with stately columns, balconies, and spacious verandas that announced, "The best people live here." 2 had belonged almost from the beginning to members of my father's extended family, to Williamses, Bells, and Mobleys. Strewn among these landmarks were gabled Victorian farmhouses with gingerbread trim, white picket fences, and neat flower beds, as well as simple cottages, old stores, and warehouses smelling of seed corn and animal feed, smoked hams and sturdy bolts of calico. A scattering of outbuildings peeked from behind and between the larger edifices, chicken coops and smokehouses, a tannery, a coffin-maker's premises. Among the public shops were a Williams' uncle's drugstore, the post office, 2 gas stations, and Evelyn's Cafe. Evelyn was my mother's younger sister, a sexy, blue-eyed, tough-talking, chain-smoking woman. Around 900 people populated Hamilton proper in those days, 600 of them black and 300 white. After bumping across the railroad tracks at the depot, we'd pass a bevy of Negro shacks, raucous with orange hollyhocks in summer, and then we'd pull into our Hadley grandparents' gravel driveway. It was a plain small house, 6 rooms, 2 front, 2 middle, 2 back, with screened porches back and front. Beside it blossomed Gemama's riotous garden of snapdragons, sweet peas, roses, zinnias, and marigolds. Inside, her house was adorned with her creations: hooked rugs, French-embroidered baby dresses, knitted afghans, patchwork quilts, crocheted antimacassars, and needlepoint chair seats. Though we'd eaten less than an hour earlier, the kids would make a beeline for Gemama's red and white kitchen, where leftover fried chicken and biscuits, still warm in the oven, prepared by Hopi, her maid, awaited us. After that, there were endless possibilities for pleasure. We could ride the cow in the back pasture, or pretend the propane tank or cotton bales were horses. Or we could play fort in the smokehouse, or Tarzan in the apple tree. Or we could swipe strawberries from our great-grandmother Dee Dee's garden, the Quarters, as it was once called, cut paper dolls from old Sears catalogs, read the Saturday Evening Post, shoot our cousin Buster's Red Ryder BB gun at birds and one another, duel with spears torn off Gemama's massive Spanish dagger bush, or line the steel rails across the street with pennies, so the afternoon man-of-war would flatten them as it chugged by. But our favorite Sunday pastime was a visit to the courthouse with Dad Doug. By that time, Marion Douglas Hadley, my maternal grandfather, had been sheriff for more years than anyone cared to count. I was proud to be the granddaughter of a sheriff. Dad Doug was tall and lean, a Gary Cooper kind of guy with clear blue eyes, wavy brown hair, and a face deeply furrowed by the sun. He kept his badge in his wallet and his gun in his glove compartment, drove a regular unmarked Ford like everyone else, and wore the khaki shirt and pants and white socks of every other white farmer in Harris County, along with a straw hat in summer or a felt hat in winter. His only effort at a uniform was a thin black tie. Every summer, my sister and I would spend a week or two in Hamilton. We ate breakfast at sunrise, awakened by Gemama's call and the irresistible smell of bacon, eggs, toast, and coffee. Sometimes, when we lay abed too long, Dad Doug would swoop one of us up by the feet and hold us upside down until we squealed. This playful side, however, was a rarity. Most often we'd be at the table in our pajamas, waiting, when Dad Doug would walk in, tousle our hair as he sat down, and say, "Hey there, girls." Those are among the few words I can remember coming from his mouth, other than, "Don't touch that gun," a remark he made specifically to our cousin Steve one day when he left us briefly in the car at his farm. Steve disobeyed him, and the gun lay in several pieces when he returned. We sat quietly as the two took a little walk into the woods. Nothing was ever said about it. On our Sunday outings, he'd take us by Shorty Grant's Amico station for moon pies, orange knee-highs, or chocolate ice cream in paper cups with tiny wooden spoons. The station reeked of rubber and oil and gas fumes. Shorty was a little bow-legged man with a pot belly and a kindly way with kids. Snacks were always on the house for the sheriff's grandchildren. In warm weather, Hamilton Police Chief Willie Buchanan, baggy trouser legs rolled to his knees to reveal pasty calves, a Jesus fan in one hand and a Coca-Cola in the other, would be sitting on the park bench in front of the courthouse. While the two men chatted on the bench, or Dad Doug worked in his office, we children had free run of the stately mahogany courtroom. There we performed elaborate trials. Because we'd never actually watched a trial except in westerns, ours were concocted in our wild imaginations, or more often inspired by the gossip we overheard among the grown-ups on Gemama's front porch. Since there were only 4 of us, sometimes 5 when Cousin Buster joined us, we took turns being judge, jury, sheriff, prosecutor, and criminal. Once or twice, when one of the 2 jail cells out back was empty, we'd extend our drama into that damp stone place with all its smells and whispers. Summers in Hamilton were even better than our Sunday trips, for then my sister and I were allowed to splash in Mulberry Creek with the Black Weaver children who lived on Dad Doug's farm. Best of all, we got to wait tables at Evelyn's. It was a simple place, long and narrow, with a linoleum floor, wide fly-specked front window, and metal tables. Our Aunt Evelyn was the star, flitting from kitchen to dining room, issuing orders to the cook, flirting, joking, scolding, and teasing her customers, most of whom were kinfolk either by blood or marriage. There were no menus, and the folks who came in for lunch simply ordered what they had a taste for: country fried steak, Ham, BLT, chicken salad. If the makings weren't in the kitchen, my sister and I dashed out the back screen door and into the grocery store to get them. No one seemed to mind the wait. Caught.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?